Thank you for coming. Let's start with the tendencies. Can you please outline the numbers of deceased people and wounded people as the result of conflict in eastern Ukraine?
In the report that we're launching today, that covers a 3-month period from the 16th of May to the 15th of August, there were 105 civilian casualties, 12 people were killed and 93 people injured. This, in fact, is actually a 30% increase in the last report compared to the last 3 months, previous reporting period. But if we look back at the same time frame last year, it's actually a 37% decrease. This shows the unpredictability of the conflict and also highlights what people are having to go through. They never quite know what the next day is going to bring. When we look at what is the reason for the civilian casualties, then we see that there's 40% of civilian casualties are caused by unexploded ordnance, landmines and hand grenades. So when there is shelling, the tendency is for civilian casualties to rise. We saw an increase particularly in the second half of April and running through into June. And then with the 1st of July harvest ceasefire, then there were less civilian casualties, which shows that a recommitment to a ceasefire actually does have a clear result for individuals. It saves lives. But the problem is that we do see these recommitments to ceasefires, but they're like sort of bandages. They never actually fully bring the conflict to an end, and that's what we need to see.
Okay, so I also would like to address the question of mines, because there is a huge percentage of people who became the victims of these mines. What does it tell us? Is it the lack of the signs about this minefields? Is it the lack of information policy, or is it basically like a poor demining?
Well, we have an ongoing conflict, so in order for proper demining to really be able to really start, we need to see an end to the conflict. Clearly, there also needs to be proper demarcation where there are mines, and for that to happen, there need to be proper records and so forth.
What is more is that you blame the Ukrainian government for the almost 60% of violations of human rights in Donbas. At the same time, you claim that you don't have a full access to the occupied territories, especially the prisons and the detention centers. So, to your opinion, how would the numbers change if you had the full access there?
So what's important about the figures is that the figures and the percentages reflect the cases on the violations that we've documented. What is also important is we document violations that go on both sides of the contact line, and it doesn't matter whether we are more active on one or the other. We will document, and it may well be that the alleged perpetrator, yes, is maybe on the other side of the contact line or maybe on that very same contact line. It doesn't correspond that violating, being in one area particularly gives the direction of who we may be attributing the violation, human rights violation, to.
We also know about the huge, almost 200% increase in the attacks on the mass media and civil rights activists. Do you know what are the reasons for that, and what is the development that you expect out of this?
I think, I mean, we can all see that there has been an increase. We can see that this comes from different sources. For us, what's actually important is that when there is an attack on a journalist, on a civic activist, that there is then a swift and effective investigation in order to ensure that the perpetrator is found responsible, and that there is justice also for the victim, and that in this way the question of impunity is addressed in order to prevent further attacks.
Sure, but can you also elaborate on the question of justice as general? And we know that there is a huge pressure on judges and advocates and lawyers of those who are involved in the cases on Maidan and in eastern Ukraine as well. Can you explain us what's happening there?
So we do monitor the trials that are ongoing with regards to Maidan, the second May violence in Odessa, that took place in Odessa, and also conflict-related cases. Our findings with regard to cases relating to the conflict are that there is specific pressure or at times on judges either to convict a defendant if they are perceived or seen to have been sort of part of the former fighting call from the Ukraine, or if the defendant is has links or affiliation, or is being alleged to have links or affiliation to the armed groups. What is concerning to us is that in cases related to the conflict, in this reporting period, we've documented that 60% of the convictions were due to plea bargains. We have a very clear recommendation in the report that judges need to carefully review when a plea bargain is brought before them to ensure that the defendant hasn't done this due to pressure, due to ill treatment or torture, because in a number of those cases, we've also documented that there was actually no evidence in that case. So that is a concerning development. When we come to the situation of Maidan and Odessa, in Maidan, we've actually seen positive development in both. With regards to Maidan, we have seen that the case has been reopened into the killing of a journalist. And with regards to Odessa, senior police officers have now been indicted for the violence that took place in the afternoon on the 2nd of May that led to the death of 6 individuals. One of the pressure points that we see, or the influences that we see playing out in the courtroom, and it can be towards the judge, the defendant, lawyers, prosecutors, any of the actors in the courtroom, comes from members of right-wing groups. We've reported on this before, and again, this goes to the whole question of really trying to move the situation so that we do have an independence of the judiciary, and that individuals are really able to obtain justice when they are in the courtroom. I mean, be it the victims, or similarly, be it the defendants as well.
Okay, so can we also talk about the question of journalists' rights in the eastern Ukraine? Because we also know that the occupied territories have the so-called legislation that also doesn't give people the right to free speech, free communication, the freedom of thought. How does it happen there, and what are the violations of journalists' rights there?
What we say, and what we've documented in this report, is that there is a situation there where people feel uneasy to speak out in a public space. So the concern is that there isn't enough being done to really enable free speech, peaceful assembly, and so forth. So that's the sort of environment it's stifling.
And if we talk about the Ukraine in general, what's the situation with journalists' rights? Because with journalists, we experience a lot of pressure from the society, and especially the right-wing groups, about what we are covering, how we are covering. So do you know about the situation with journalists' rights in Ukraine in general?
Well, we're documenting the situation, particularly severe violations that take place with journalists. Clearly, over the years, we've documented the very grave violations, such as when the journalists that have been killed. And again, this goes to the question of when there is a serious violation, that there is a proper investigation. And I think that's something that we still haven't yet seen in a number of cases, and it also relates to the deaths of journalists that we've seen over the past year.
So in, let's say, the death of Pavel Sheremet, are you happy with how the investigation is going on?
No, I mean, we say in the report, and I mean, he's an example of where we need to see more being done in the investigation.
Let's talk about the problem of people who were imprisoned in Donbas before 2014 and who stated that they have a wish to serve their sentence in Ukraine. Do you keep in touch with them? How we can help them? We know that you have some connections in Donbas, but not as much in Luhansk region. What's the situation here?
We do have contacts through means with people who are detained, and we are very much aware of the situation regarding those people who were detained prior to 2014 and want to be now transferred to government-controlled territory. And we are very keen to see that that actually does take place. We've been one of the many who've been encouraging that since that work began back in 2015 and 16. So we're working with all to ensure that that actually can happen, and we need to see some unblocking of the situation so that it can restart again, because the transfers haven't happened for nearly a year now.
Let's take finally the report on Crimea. We know that Russia is violating the 4th Geneva Convention, and you don't have a full access there. There are limited resources. Can you tell us how did you investigate the human rights violations there, and what were the results?
We use the same methodology as we do in any other part of Ukraine. The difference being that because we don't have access, it takes more time to verify information. We obviously have less contact with the authorities there, as well as if we need to follow up on a particular case. It takes more time to develop the contacts with either a victim or a witness. But people do travel in and out of Crimea. We have ways of talking to people who remain on the peninsula. And then we also are able to corroborate a lot of the information that we receive through public documentation, public records, judgments, and so forth. So we have to take a slightly different approach, but the basis for the work is the same as we use in the conflict zone and in the broader area of Ukraine.
And did you anyhow document the violations of human rights in regards to the Crimean Titan and the harmful evaporations that are happening there, the ecological disaster that is happening there?
So, as with many, we are following that situation. We're following it particularly from a legal perspective, and it's obviously a complex matter. And we're really trying to look at it and trying to work with others who have particular expertise in questions of human rights and the environment, and how that also impacts on certain rights, such as with regards to health and well-being. So it's, I would say, work in progress, and we need to also undertake a lot of consultation with others who have particular expertise in that area.
Okay, thank you.